Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. This week, we're talking about Pop Up Magazine and how it grew from a semi-regular event in California into a full-fledged media company that now constantly tours U.S. cities. It started in 2009 in San Francisco. A couple of journalists got the idea of putting together a magazine, but instead of setting it to print, they would perform it live. Pop Up Magazine, as the event was called, was a huge hit, and the founders had to seek out larger and larger theaters in order to meet demand. In 2015, they decided to take the show on the road, touring Pop Up Magazine across several major cities. I recently sat down with Chaz Edwards, co-founder and president of Pop Up Magazine. I asked him about the logistics of creating a live magazine from scratch, how the company makes money, and what the future holds for it now that it's been purchased by the Emerson Collective. Let's jump right into it. Hey, Chaz, thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here, Simon.
So you're the publisher for Pop Up Magazine, and then you also have a title, another title with California Sunday Magazine. We'll talk about that in a second. What's your 15-second elevator pitch for what Pop Up Magazine is?
Sure. It's a live magazine performed on stage by prominent writers, filmmakers, photographers, radio people who are performing all original stories, never before seen, screened, or published. And it's a multimedia experience. Film and animation, illustration, and photography are projected onto a giant screen above the stage. And each of the stories is being live scored by our house band on stage next to the contributor.
Yeah, and in some cases, that band is actually creating, I think, original compositions that coincide with the storytelling that's happening on the stage, right?
That's right, almost entirely. So almost all of the music that you hear from the Magic Orchestra is original composition developed to complement the live journalism on stage.
And there's always a person who's on the stage, and you mentioned the multimedia experience. Sometimes you guys have created like a live animation that is happening. So while that person is narrating, there's like this really cool photography, or like you said, like a cartoon or animation that's going along that's like timed perfectly along with the speech that they're giving on the stage as well.
Yes. So on the screen, when the contributor is a photographer, what's on the screen is often that photographer's work. So you're seeing original photography, and the audience is experiencing a live photo essay. If it's a filmmaker, we're very often using film from some project that they're working on. But to your point, if a writer or a radio producer that may not have photography or film associated with that story, Pop Up Magazine will commission original artwork, animation, illustration to be the art layer for that story. And you mentioned sort of the way those work together. It's uncommon that Pop Up Magazine is pressing play on a single animated film at the beginning of a piece, and the contributor at the microphone is having to stay synced up with that. It works the other way around. So the contributor, who is always a journalist, either a writer or filmmaker, a photographer, the contributor at the microphone is working from a script. And then in the tech booth at the back of the theater, the Pop Up Magazine team is firing up photos or animation or other multimedia elements that key off of the contributor's pacing. So we don't require that the writer or radio producer who's performing live, they don't have to pay attention to what's happening on the screen. That's something that we mix live on their behalf.
And you basically created a scalable version of This American Life's live shows, because I've been to a few. I've never actually been to the live, but I've been to some of the where they would stream it to movie theaters, and it seems like what you guys are doing are very close to what they would do, but they would do it at a much less scalable version of it.
Yeah, that's right. We make a new show, a new issue of our live magazine several times a year, and when we do it, the way we achieve scale is a couple of ways. One, in markets where the audience is growing, we go to bigger and bigger theaters. So when we're in New York, for example, we're at the Opera House in Brooklyn. In the San Francisco Bay Area, we We perform in very big theaters out here, like the Paramount Theater in Oakland or the Curran or Davies Symphony Hall in San Francisco. So one way that we're able to scale is as the audience is grows bigger, the number of people that want to come to the show is bigger, we get bigger theaters and sell tickets for people to be there. The other way that we've accomplished some level of scale is that when we make a new show, we tour it around the country. So we go on the road with all of those contributors and with the band and visit 6 to 12 cities over the course of 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, and that's what I kind of meant by scalable, in the sense of like This American Life probably does this like once every few years and just does it once, whereas like you guys are like constantly creating new content for different cities and taking it on tour and stuff like that. So you guys are like, what you guys are undertaking is basically a much larger undertaking of what they do like once every few years. The origin story for Pop-Up Magazine is kind of interesting because it's intertwined with this sister publication, the California Sunday Magazine. And I guess we don't need to get too far into that, but like, so, and I think you played a founding role in both. Can you talk briefly about kind of how these two things originated?
Sure. So Pop-Up Magazine started first, and it started in 2009 here in San Francisco. It wasn't even a company at the time. It was really an idea, the brainchild of a couple of my more creative colleagues, Doug McGray, Lauren Smith, Derek Fagerstrom, and Evan Ratliff came up with this idea of taking inspiration from a magazine, but turning it into a live show. And so in 2009, at a little theater here in San Francisco, the first Pop-Up Magazine happened, and people showed up purely by word of mouth and didn't know what to expect. And people liked what they saw. And so after the show, when we were mingling and having a beer with the contributors and everybody who came to the show, people asked us when we were doing the next one. And we didn't have plans for a next one, but it seemed like we struck a chord with some people. So we began to create a new Pop-Up Magazine show twice a year, once in the spring, once in the fall. And we just performed it in San Francisco. But every other show that we put on, we had to triple the size of the theater that we rented to do the event. That just through word of mouth and people telling their friends and social media and no conventional marketing of any kind, Pop-Up Magazine was reaching more and more people. And that continued for several years until we started to realize that, selling out a symphony hall of nearly 3,000 seats in 10 or 15 minutes, it was bigger than a hobby. It was bigger than something that we could all do in our spare time outside of our regular jobs. And so in 2013, Doug McGray and I kind of quit our day jobs and decided to try to build a company around this that would allow us to do a couple of things. One was make Pop-Up Magazine more often, and each time we made a show, could we build the infrastructure around that so that we could tour to other cities? Because we speculated that there was nothing unique about the cultural climate of San Francisco. It's a show that attracts creative, curious people who love stories, and we knew that there were those kinds of people in a whole lot of other cities beyond San Francisco. So we decided that we wanted to do more Pop-Up Magazine and do it in more places. And at the same time, we realized there's always a limit to the number of people you can fit into any given theater on any given night. And so we said, why don't we launch alongside Pop-Up Magazine, Pop-Up Magazine is always done at night during the week after work, which is a nice leisure time in your day. You're not being interrupted by meetings and phone calls. You can turn off your phone. You can lose yourself in stories for a couple of hours and be very immersed in journalism. And we recognize that the other time of the week that is a similar open space for people is the weekend. So we decided in 2013 that we would start touring Pop-Up Magazine, and alongside that, we would launch a new print and digital title to reach the same audience with the same kinds of stories, the same sensibility, but to deliver it to audiences on the weekend onto their phones and laptops, and also in a beautiful print edition for people who prefer reading a magazine on paper.
And so I feel like we could do a whole other episode on California Sunday Magazine, and so I don't want to go too far into it. I seem to remember listening to a podcast interview with someone where you guys had like a cool distribution strategy where to save money, you like had it, you like approached the LA Times. So rather than having to do all the distribution yourself, you like had it as like an insert inside the weekend LA Times, and that somehow saved you guys money and also got you your initial kind of print audience and stuff like that. Was that?
Yep.
I remember.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Remembering that correctly.
Yeah, and it's the LA Times and it's also the San Francisco Chronicle. So it's the two big metro papers of the West Coast of California, which around the time we were launching, we put out the first issue of California Sunday at the end of 2014. That was a time where those big metro newspapers of the West had very big Sunday distribution, big readership, but at the time they were all pulling out of or had already pulled out of doing their own weekend magazine that would be similar to the New York Times magazine. And so we saw that as an opportunity for us to reach a large audience very quickly. And we also thought that it might be an opportunity for those papers to deliver a compelling weekend magazine product to their audiences that they weren't doing on their own.
Well, like I said, I feel like we could do a whole episode on that. But you had some interesting stops along the way leading up to Pop-Up Magazine. You were both at Dig and Federated Media. In fact, I read that you had helped develop the native ads on Dig. I actually remember these because I was really big into Dig. That later became ubiquitous on the internet. So it's probably not a coincidence that Pop-Up Magazine has a heavy native advertising component.
Yeah, I mean, so I've spent most of my career doing media startups. I started in the old days at magazine companies like Ziff Davis. I then spent a lot of time at web publishers like CNET and like Dig and Federated Media. And particularly the time I spent at Federated Media and at Dig, it was a very dynamic time in the world of digital media and how brands might engage with audiences on blogs and across social media. And we had an opportunity at Federated Media and then again at Dig to do some sort of interesting early experimentation in ways that we could invite sponsors to the party, if you will, in a way that was very transparent, that it was sponsored content, but to develop sponsored content that was as engaging, as compelling, as interactive as any of the editorial material on those same publications. And so it was a great experience, and it's certainly informed everything I've done since. I mean, as a media company, you only exist to serve an audience with unique and wonderful experiences. That includes editorial experiences, but it also includes the advertising and sponsorship that's touching those audiences as well. And if you stop delighting your audience, or if your sponsorship and advertising products aren't as delightful as everything else, you've got nothing.
And we'll talk a little bit more about how you guys develop your ads. But one thing that's always repeated in every showing that I've been to is that, like, you guys always say, this performance isn't recorded. It's basically going to disappear once this performance is over. Like, why did you guys decide to do this? Because you look at some other things like The Moth, and obviously a lot of already existing podcasts do like live showings and then redistribute those as recordings. Seems like there would be a great distribution and monetization strategy there for you guys to create a really hit podcast out of this. What made you decide not to really take that avenue?
Well, the place that we started from was when you make media on a stage in a room with an audience sitting together in the dark, a live magazine presents opportunities that are totally unique and totally original and can't be replicated on other platforms. And we wanted to make shows that felt magical, that took advantage of the fact that everybody had driven over to the theater or taken a cab over to the theater and sat down and was going to spend an evening with us. And so there are things that we can do inside Pop-Up Magazine that you can't do any other way. Like we do lighting design in certain stories where a story spills off the stage and is being projected onto the walls and ceiling of the theater. We've done stories where it's a story about food in one shape or another, and we can use the fact that we're in a live theater to actually give everyone in the theater something to taste, so that they're not only hearing and listening to the story and looking at beautiful images on the screen, but they're actually tasting their way into a story. We did one kind of funny story at Pop-Up Magazine a couple of years ago that was about karaoke gone wrong, where sometimes fights break out in karaoke bars and the like. Some genuine violence breaking out in the Philippines and to a lesser extent elsewhere. And so we ended up having a reporter from Rolling Stone tell the story and sort of frame it as the top 5 worst karaoke songs of all time. And because we were live in a theater and we had a band on stage, as she was finishing it and she names the worst karaoke song of all time, we had thousands of people in these theaters all joined together and we all sang karaoke together. And so the reason that we haven't filmed the shows from the back of the room is in part because we didn't design the stories to be podcasts or to be videos on YouTube. We want to take advantage of the unique experience of being in a theater to tell stories in a more immersive way, in a way that can only be done live. So that's sort of the starting argument for why we did it that way. Something else has come out of that, which has been interesting to us, and that is that the audiences and fans that come to the shows recognize that we're making something just for them that night, so that it's special. So it's the kind of thing that you have to be there to experience and enjoy. And there's something rare about that, and there's something fun about that, so that when someone comes to a Pop-Up Magazine show at the Warner Theater in DC, and a couple of their colleagues were out of town, or a few of their friends couldn't make it that night, and they say, well, oh, you went to see this show, what happened? That friend can't just send them a video of what happened. That friend is put in the position of having to recount his or her favorite pieces from the show and describe them and pass that story from one friend to another. And it creates a real kind of intimacy and excitement around the format that I think makes it more fun next time for the folks who missed the show to get themselves a ticket and try it themselves.
So I understand your argument, both arguments, and certainly what you said about kind of the exclusivity of it. I feel like at least 50% of the 50% of the show could translate well to a podcast like that. Like there might be visual elements, but they're not 100% needed. I know This American Life got around that by they would just edit out the parts that were 100 that needed the visual and would just have the more pure audio only ones like in the podcast / show. Is it an ongoing debate within Pop-Up Magazine whether you guys should do this, or is it just pretty much unanimous that this is how it's going to be?
No, I should point out that it's by the fact that we create a live show and we don't film it that night isn't to say that we don't believe adaptations of stories that we make shouldn't reach audiences in other formats. And so many stories that were born on the stage of Pop-Up Magazine in some adapted form have later become a podcast on This American Life or a story on Invisibilia from NPR. We've had stories that start on the stage of Pop-Up Magazine and in a different form, perhaps a longer form or with more photography, end up as magazine pieces in our own publication, the California Sunday Magazine, or sometimes at the New York Times Magazine or the New Yorker or other places. And there have even been some stories that started on the stage of Pop-Up Magazine, and someone from a Hollywood production company has approached us and said, could I option that story and develop a version of it for television or film? And so we very much embrace the idea of adaptation of these stories and bringing them to other formats. The only thing that we believe strongly is that you don't want to film a magazine piece and call it a TV show. You might take that magazine piece, develop it with a screenwriter, and think about what you can do on television that you can't do in a magazine. That adaptation process, we believe, is very important because great television should always be great television. A great magazine piece shouldn't feel like the transcription from a podcast where you can't hear the ambient sound. And likewise, when we make an edition of Pop-Up Magazine, we want to do as much as we can to make each of those stories feel very native and wonderful for the live audience in the room. And that might just be a starting point for many of those stories to find audiences in a slightly different format somewhere else.
So in its early days, most pop-up magazine performances, I think, were hosted most just solely in California. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, I seem to remember that maybe you guys had some early one-off tours, like where you would do a tour, but then it would mostly go back to California. And then it became a thing where you guys are almost constantly touring, like basically year round. What was that kind of evolution and transition like, and what was the thinking behind it?
Yeah, you're right. It very much started. It wasn't even fully California. It was really just San Francisco. So from 2009 until the very end of 2014, Pop-Up Magazine was almost exclusively an experience that happened in a theater in San Francisco somewhere. We in those early years, we did one collaboration with ESPN. It was a sports themed edition of Pop-Up Magazine, but it was a one night show that we performed in New York. But outside of that, until 2014, we were exclusively a San Francisco kind of experience. But it was at that time that as we started to build a company around this, and by build a company, I just mean, we started to hire some staff who could do this full time. We raised some money so that we could invest in talent and travel. And so at the end of 2014, it was the very first time we took one show and we performed it in different cities. And that was just San Francisco and Los Angeles. And it was an experiment to see two things, really. One, what is it like? What do we need to know to travel a show from one city to another? Really just kind of a logistics question. The second thing was we wanted to prove out our theory that there were probably receptive audiences in other cities beyond San Francisco. And so at the end of 2014, one show performed twice in San Francisco and once in Los Angeles was an experiment that went well. It was a great learning experience for us. And since that time, so basically every time we've made a new Pop-Up Magazine show, 2015 to the present, we make a show with the intention of bringing that to cities around the country.
And so I seem to remember hearing that you guys create, like you customize the shows in some way for each city. How do you guys do that?
So many of the so for the winter tour, for example, that's coming up, kicking off at the end of this month and continuing into February, there will be a core of stories that travel with us to every market. So if an evening of Pop-Up Magazine has 10 or 11 stories in it, maybe 8 of those or 9 of those will be traveling with us to every market. But then in addition to that, we almost always do 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 stories that are only being performed at that show in that city. And it's an opportunity for us to find a story that might have particular resonance for the audience in one market, but that may not be as resonant in other markets. So for example, when we're in Los Angeles, many of the people who come to the shows are people who work in or are connected to the entertainment business. And so we will often in LA do a story that is being performed by some Hollywood talent or someone who's a household name to the entertainment industry in Los Angeles, but may not be as well known outside of Los Angeles. Or another example would be when we come to DC, where we have a lot of people in the audience who are connected to the federal government in one way or another. There's an opportunity for us to do a story that covers national politics in a deep and interesting way that might be especially exciting to an audience in DC, but less so to an audience in Atlanta.
What's the submission and recruitment process like for these stories?
So we start the process probably 5 or 6 months before the first performance on a tour. We have a team of producers here at Pop-Up Magazine that are reaching out to their favorite writers and filmmakers and photographers and illustrators and animators and creative people across the spectrum and check in with them about sort of what they're working on and explore sort of stories that might be relevant to Pop-Up Magazine. And many of those conversations end up turning into a story pitch of some kind. And over the months leading up to a new Pop-Up Magazine tour, our producers will look at maybe 200 different story pitches before they assign the 15 or so stories that we then edit, develop, art direct, compose music for, and take on tour. So that's really the longest part of our process is the outreach to the world of journalism to find great never before told stories and figure out if they would be compelling live experience pieces.
And what's the rehearsal process like in terms of refining those stories? Like I'm assuming the people are spread out all across the country. Are they just doing it like coming in through like Skype meetings to rehearse there, or the producers flying out to them? Are you flying them all out to one central location? Like what? Because these are very well polished by the time they reach the stage.
Well, I'm delighted to hear you say that. And now I will tell you sort of the process that we go through. So the first phase of the process for us is very much like the editorial process for a magazine that's not live, meaning our producers are out looking at story pitches, they're assigning a story, and when they assign a story, that contributor submits a script, and that script is then edited. So it's really very much like any other magazine where stories are going back and forth between a producer and the contributor and their edits and cuts and development areas. And then once we lock down the script, and one thing that is quite different from a print magazine, say, or a digital magazine, is that the story, the number of words in a story in a feature for Pop-Up Magazine are fewer than a feature for the New Yorker, for example. So given that we're working inside of live, a long feature for us is going to be 9 or 10 minutes long, which is shorter than your average feature in a magazine. And so there's sort of making sure that we're editing a script for live is an important first step in the process. From there, once we lock in on a script, that's when we bring in the art department who starts to take a look at what materials we have to work with. Is this a photographer? Let's start to develop that photo essay. Or if it's a piece where we're going to be commissioning original photography or animation or illustration, the art department is then working with that finalized script to develop that and commission original art. And that's happening in parallel with us sharing the script with the band. And we do a table read of the script. So one of our producers will actually read out loud the story so that the band can hear the pacing of it and get a sense of how long that will be when it's performed live on stage. We, as far as actual rehearsals, the day before our first show on a new tour is really the first day that we have everybody in the same room at the same time. And so we're unable to get into the theaters until the day of the show. So what that means is the day before we do a mock rehearsal here at our office in San Francisco, or if we're kicking off a tour in Los Angeles, we'll just do it in a hotel room, which is really the first time that the performers are at a microphone standing in front of a screen with their actual art on it. So we rehearse the day before, and then we get really one dress rehearsal in the theater the morning of the first night's performance.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk a little bit about like some of the behind the scenes logistics. Like first off, like how many employees are traveling around the country putting these on? Like it seems like this would create a lot of traveling burnout.
There is a little of that, yes. So most of the people that you see on stage at Pop-Up Magazine are not staff employees. They're freelance contributors that are joining us for that tour, but they're not staff members permanently. But when we do go on tour, our team of producers, a couple of whom you see as the hosts of the show. So the hosts are actually story producers, and we just pick 2 out of the 4 producers who will be hosts for that night. And then the other producers are backstage, kind of running the show and working with the contributors so that everyone's hitting their marks. And then we have a small technical team, technical producers who are in the tech booth at the back of the theater. And what they're doing is we have one person who's adjusting sound, because unlike a movie, for example, where everything is pre-mixed, including the sound and coordination, we have a live band. We have one person at a microphone. We often have audio or video clips with separate sound. And so mixing sound levels live is pretty sophisticated. And so we always bring our own person to be doing the sound mixing. And then we also have a tech producer who's running the show off of a computer. So I mentioned before that we don't we're not often just kind of hitting play on a 8-minute film or animation that's behind a performer. We're actually mixing a lot of different component media pieces. And so we have a technical producer who's running the screen from the tech booth. And then we have a couple of other people that are doing front of house stuff, which is just making sure that guests are getting their tickets and getting to their seats. And so from a staff standpoint, depending on the show, it's probably about 10 people, 8 to 10 people that are traveling from our staff.
And what's the smallest market you perform in? So I guess the easy slam dunks are obviously San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and DC. How do you guys decide like when a city has enough, like can hit that threshold of being able to make it worth your while to actually visit it?
So we don't have a great algorithm for this, and so it's often a bit of gut and experimentation, and there's certain cities that have very, very big populations, but may not be as interested in what we're doing. And likewise, there are sometimes small or mid-sized cities that, because they have a really big creative community, or you have a lot of media and journalists and creative types in that market, we can have immediate success in those places. And so each time we go on tour, we tend to add usually one city we've never been to before, and we rent a smaller theater and we experiment and we see, is there an audience that came out to the show? Did they seem to like it? Do we think that there's potential here? And if so, on the next tour or the one after that, we might go back to that city and start developing it to see sort of how big the audience opportunity in that place is. Because it's, there are markets like Austin, Texas is not a huge DMA in terms of population, but it's been a market that we brought Pop-Up Magazine there once. People seem to just love it from the get-go and tell friends. And so at least once a year we go back to Austin, Texas. And so it's kind of an iterative process for us of doing some experimentation, generally at a smaller theater. We don't rent the Opera House or the Symphony Hall the first time we go to a new city. And we try to meet a community there, and we spend a little bit of time in advance of the show getting to know other arts organizations and journalism departments at school and performing arts groups, and try to build relationships with the community, because those allies in a market can be really helpful at spreading the word for us and introducing us to new folks out there.
And how do you choose the venues? Like I must confess, I was one of those loyal attendees who was a little miffed when it switched to a venue that used Ticketmaster because it increased the price significantly.
Yes.
So what goes into like choosing this venue?
Well, Ticketmaster is one consideration. That's, you are not alone in that Ticketmaster has much higher fees than anyone else, and so that's kind of a strike against a theater when we're going into a market. So putting together a tour it's kind of a game of three-dimensional chess, where we need to visit a set number of cities that we've decided in advance we want to go visit, and we don't want to be zigzagging across the country to do it. So we say, well, during the first week, if on this tour we want to go to Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and then we also want to go to DC and New York and Boston, that constrains us a little bit. We say that we need to string together all of the West Coast tour stops so that they're pretty close in time, and then we all jump on a plane and go to the East Coast and finish the tour there, or vice versa. So sometimes we don't have all the control that we would want. Sometimes we end up in a market and we say, look, we have to do the DC show on Thursday night because Tuesday night is New York and Saturday night's Atlanta. So we only have one night to do that. And if a theater that might be better for the show is unavailable that night, we sometimes have to go to an alternative venue for that purpose. So sometimes we end up at a Ticketmaster theater, and that was really our only choice in the market. Or sometimes there's a Ticketmaster theater here in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is the Paramount in Oakland, and we just love so much about that venue and its location and its acoustics and its seating capacity that it's so good in so many other ways that it's a preferred theater of ours, even though it is Ticketmaster. Because we look at, if you think about the experience of a pop-up magazine show. When we look at a venue, we say, we need a stage that's big enough so that we can have a performer at the microphone on one side of the stage and have room for our 4-person band on the other side of the stage. So that's, you sometimes go places that are reconfigured old movie theaters that just don't have a big enough stage for our format. And likewise, the giant screen above the band and performer is an absolutely essential part of what pop-up magazine is. And so we need to select theaters that have giant screens and a high quality viewing experience for everybody in the theater. Sometimes you'll go to a venue that's built for musical performances where it's all about the sound, and there might be parts of that theater that don't have good sight lines to the stage or the screen, and that would make it an unideal venue for pop-up magazine.
And you guys, from a marketing perspective, you guys have very aggressive marketing. I notice you do a lot of social media retargeting. Like whenever there's a show coming close, I see nonstop ads on Facebook, Twitter, even display ads at like the New York Times. When I'm reading a story, I'll see a pop-up magazine. I remember I did tweet complaint about the Ticketmaster thing, and somebody reached out to me immediately and offered a discount code. And it seems like that's going to be very important because you're marketing to different audiences in different cities. So you guys have to have like some pretty aggressive local marketing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a lot. Our marketing efforts and budgets are a lot smaller than you might think, because for most of our history, the way we've gotten people to shows is organically through word of mouth. Almost probably the bulk of people who come to Pop-Up Magazine ended up there because a friend of theirs had been to it and said, check this out when it comes to your city. And people will also join our email list, which we're not a very active emailer for Pop-Up Magazine. We really just use our email list to let people know when a new show's coming and how they can get tickets for it. And so really word of mouth and social media and email have been the primary ways that we develop audience. More recently, we've started experimenting with quite small budgets doing some social media advertising, basically advertising on through Facebook and through Google, because of their ability to target people who have expressed interest in the show before, perhaps been to the show before, visited our website. And so you as a previous attendee at a Pop-Up Magazine show, and you've probably visited our website and signed up for our newsletter, the way Facebook and Google work is that they assume you're probably a really good candidate for wanting to come to the next one when it's in town. And so you end up seeing quite a few ads about the new Pop-Up Magazine show coming to DC. But in terms of our investment, that's the only paid advertising we do is really with Google and with Facebook at a very localized level, with a heavy emphasis on people that have been before or people that seem to have a very similar profile to folks who have been before.
And that really just speaks to like the fact that you don't spend much, but you can be kind of ubiquitous towards the people who really count. Like I'm guessing you guys are using I think it's called tailored audiences, where you can upload your email list to Facebook or Google, and then it'll target people who are on Facebook who have that same email address. Or you're seeing who you're basically attaching a cookie to my browser when I visit your website and then following me around the internet. But I mean, yours is one of the few ads on the internet I actually see that aren't like basically, I'm sure you've heard of ad blindness, where you don't even notice ads half the time. So it's a good use of targeting, and especially since you're not really spending that much money.
That's great to hear. I mean, that's our intention. Partly by necessity, we don't have big budgets to do it, so we have to try to be judicious with how we spend it. And to us, we really just want to make sure that people who already like us or are inclined to like the experience we have, we want to make sure that we don't come through town and have any of those people not know about it until we've moved on to the next city.
Tell me about revenue. So like, is it mostly through ticket sales and then the native kind of sponsorships that you have during the show itself?
Yeah, it's a mix of things. So if you look across a Pop-Up Magazine tour, probably about half the revenue we generate is through ticket sales. So that's the fans buying a ticket for themselves and a friend. The other half is coming from the sponsors in the show. You've seen the show before, and in between every few editorial stories, just like when you're turning the page of a magazine and every few pages you have a display spread in the print magazine, we have a live event equivalent of that. So in between editorial stories, we project on the screen advertisement to signal to the audience that this is going to be a little sponsored moment, and then we take anywhere from 30 to 75 seconds to deliver something branded content, deliver something on behalf of one of the sponsors of the show. And what we found in the early days of Pop-Up Magazine is and this is still largely true today, when you talk to a brand or an advertiser, they tend not to have a specialist on staff that makes advertising for live performance magazines, because I don't know if I think we might be the only live performance magazine. And so what that meant is we needed to help the sponsors. So once we convinced a brand that they might be a good fit for our audience, they might make sense for them to be a part of our show, and they say, "That's terrific news, Chaz. Like, love your audience. I'm in. Here's the money." And then they say, "Oh, what do I do? What do I do with the space that I bought from you?" And so we have a team in-house here, a brand studio team, which is it's a separate group from our editorial team, but it's people with pretty similar backgrounds in a lot of ways. It's mostly staffed with people who come out of the world of editorial work at magazines and radio. And the brand studio collaborates with the sponsors to develop something that will help convey what that brand wants to communicate about their new product or their brand or whatever it may be, but to do so in a way that feels very organic to the Pop-Up Magazine experience. So, for example, Coach, the luxury brand that makes apparel and leather goods, Coach approached us and said, this is the audience that we want to reach, but we don't have any assets that we could just drop into your show. And so we pitched them on an idea. We said, we're going to be visiting 7 cities on this tour that you're sponsoring, and you've indicated that your ideal customer is a woman in her 20s or early 30s that lives in one of these metropolitan areas. Why don't we create a content series that will be performed on stage at Pop-Up Magazine in the shape of live photo essays? Each one will be basically directed by a different cool, creative young woman in the different cities we're visiting. And so every stop on that tour, when we were in New Orleans as a part of that tour, we worked with a local photographer and kind of store owner in New Orleans to give us a guided tour of New Orleans in a way that even local New Orleans residents would benefit from. And we turned that into a photo essay that was then performed on stage as a commercial break at Pop-Up Magazine. So that's sort of one example of let's develop a photo essay that has the same kind of quality and sensibility of a Pop-Up Magazine story, but it's just serving a different purpose. In this case, it's introducing an audience to something new from Coach. With our upcoming show, as part of the winter tour, we've been working with a longtime sponsor, MailChimp, on a series of short animated films, and we'll use Pop-Up Magazine as a place to preview this new series of films. So the world will not have seen these yet. They're going to be launching later in the year. But at Pop-Up Magazine, we're going to take one of those films and play it on the giant screen at Pop-Up Magazine to give our audience a sneak peek at a cool new content series that's underwritten by MailChimp.
You were recently bought I mean Pop-Up Magazine was recently bought by Laureen Powell-Jobs, who has been kind of she runs an investment group that has been investing in media. I think she also purchased a majority stake in The Atlantic. What does this mean for Pop-Up Magazine?
Well, so Emerson Collective, which is her organization, they've been a supporter and partner and investor in Pop-Up Magazine and California Sunday since almost our very beginning. So the beginning of the company phase of it. So in 2014, when we started to tour Pop-Up Magazine around the country and we launched the California Sunday magazine, right around that time, the Emerson Collective invested some money and wanted to support the work that we were doing. And they've continued to be a supporter both strategically and morally, as well as financially over our lifespan. And so it's been a great opportunity for us to get to know the team at Emerson Collective and to work with them on strategic decision making, thinking about product development questions, and the rest of the concerns you have when you're trying to build a business. We've gotten to know them very well over the last 4 years. And so as Emerson Collective is beginning to do more in the media space, you referred to their majority stake in The Atlantic and other kinds of moves that they're making in media, they started talking to us about the idea of partnering more deeply. And so we now are a wholly owned subsidiary of Emerson Collective, but in many ways, not that much changes. They've been a partner to us, a strategic advisor to us, an organization that shares our values and believes in our mission for quite a long time. And so this is really more a continuation of that rather than a stark change in our relationship to the world or in our relationship to Emerson Collective.
Are they like the new like Time Inc? Or is this more kind of analogous to like Barry Diller and IAC? Like how do we think about what she's doing?
I actually don't know the answer to that. I only have my view into kind of a sort of through a very specific lens, which is how they've worked with us and supported us. So I don't have a really full view of how they think about themselves in the media space or where they're headed next. But we're delighted to be part of the family and continue to have their support.
Okay, Chaz. Well, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you online?
You can go to popupmagazine.com and you can sign up for our newsletter there, which will tell you when the show is coming to your town and how to get tickets. And if you're interested in our other publication, California Sunday, you can go to californiasunday.com where you can read the stories we publish. Many of them also have bonus multimedia and audio layers to them there. And we hope to see you all at a pop-up magazine soon.
All right. Well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks so much for joining me.
Likewise. Thanks so much.
Okay, that's all we have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Content on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.